Hello, welcome to the University of Illinois. I'm Christian Sandvig and I'm here with Caroline Haythornthwaite. We're here for Information, Communication, and Society. We're going to be talking about Caroline's article, Social Networks and Internet Connectivity Effects. Let me start by introducing Caroline to you, and then I'll introduce myself, and then we'll talk a little bit about the paper. So Caroline is an associate professor here at the Graduate School of Library and Information Science. I'd like to particularly highlight a few of her recent publications. She was a co-editor of The Internet in Everyday Life with Barry Wellman. She was also the co-editor of Learning, Culture, and Community in Online Education, Research and Practice with a number of people. And she's currently working on a book called The Handbook of E-Learning Research with Richard Andrews. Caroline's work looks at how the Internet and computer media support work and social interactions among members of online learning and work communities. My name is Christian Sandvig. I'm also here at the University of Illinois. I'm at the Department of Speech Communication, where I study communication infrastructure. My current project is a project funded by the National Science Foundation about how new wireless communication technologies are introduced from the grassroots. So I'm very concerned about new computer media and new choices for computer media, which is why I found this article particularly interesting. But before we get to the questions, maybe, Caroline, you could introduce the article with just a few words about it.
Yeah, let me just give a little background. As I say, the article is Social Networks and Internet Connectivity Effects. And I started doing research a number of years ago looking at social networks of people communicating within co-located and distributed groups. And the first group we called Cerise, we looked at what they were communicating with each other via all the kind of media they could use. And at the time, most people weren't looking at different kinds of media, just looking at one kind of media, like everything through email. And so by looking at multiple media, we found that the closer people were tied, the more media they used. So this was kind of an interesting result, because nobody had looked at multiple before, and also nobody else had looked at how the actual ties between people affected their media use. So instead of having the message medium fit, media richness idea, it was something more along the lines of the more you want to communicate, the more media you use to communicate. So I looked at this again in a group of distance learners, and the same kind of thing came across. And there's some other studies have also found this media multiplexity. Well, then with the second group, I started looking at what media they were using with whom. And by looking at using a unidimensional scale, we found that there was, for those who were most weakly tied, who were only using one or two medium, they were all using the same one within a particular group. And then as you had a stronger tie, the more you were adding extra media. And so it seemed to me that what happened with that one that was connecting the weak ties was so important, because that creates the infrastructure on which everybody communicates. And because these people don't know each other, they are weakly tied, and by definition they don't know each other very well. It's an external decision that sets up what's going to be important for them. And that's where I set up the whole idea of what I've referred to as the latent ties, somebody who sets up a computer network of some sort, or other kind of means of people to get together, that sets up a latent tie condition. And now I use that to mean that a tie is technically possible, but not yet socially activated. And that's it does pick up from the concept of latent learning from psychology and other uses of the word latent. So from there, part of the reason that I came to this paper, which is more theoretical than the other empirical papers, is because, okay, if that's happening within a small group, what happens with the internet? And so this paper talks about, let's take that idea and how is the internet connecting everybody?
Well, I have to say, what I found impressive about this paper is the way in which it really it touches on all of the central concerns to a number of fields, such as communication, political science, sociology, information science. So when I read this paper, I was struck immediately by, you made an allusion in part of it to to this phrase that Harold Lasswell said in 1948 about the study of communication could be usefully conceptualized as who says what, in which channel, to whom, with what effect. And I mean, this has been called, although it's not fashionable anymore, it has been called the way that the field of communication was organized, this question. And similarly, another example from the 40s, political scientists, when they first started to think about media, the question that they asked in books like The People's Choice was, what's the difference between radio and newspaper, and how do these two compare to face-to-face interactions? So I like that the paper is broad enough that it really tries to make a very wide argument that touches on a lot of these central concerns of different fields about what's the difference between media, how does mediated interaction differ from face-to-face interaction, what are the consequences of different media systems. At the same time, usually in a paper that tried to do that, you wouldn't see an empirical tie, whereas in your paper, your arguments are grounded in this series of empirical studies that you've done about Cerise and the LEAP program. So this is really a great contribution. Now, personally, I don't work in social network analysis, so my first question really is sort of about that. As an outsider reading this paper, it seemed to me that you were doing something very important in that you were bringing the concept of infrastructure to social network analysis through this latent tie that you've formulated, latent tie theory. And this seems to me to be a great contribution, but I've only heard a few talks about social network analysis and read a few things, so I wonder if my interpretation of what you're doing there is accurate, or you would agree with it.
I think that's true. I think the social network area has been blossoming recently with lots of new books, a lot from physics people who've discovered social networks. The social network people have been working in the area for a very long time. You
mean things like Linked, these kinds of books?
Yes, Linked, Barbaraces, and 6 Degrees work as well. There's and the small networks. Lots of quite readable, which is nice. We have some very nice readable books about networks and the network concept. There's different ways. They're looking at whole networks and network patterns, and other ways to look at it is more on the interpersonal level and what is the tie between people. And the people in physics are very much advancing the whole mathematics and structures of networks, and there are others. Stanley Wasserman has worked extensively on the statistics of social networks, and these areas are, as I say, very interested in the mathematics of it. At the same time, social scientists are struggling to find out what's happening in reality with these. So some of the work that Barry Wellman has done, and because a number of people in the social network area have been working on the social aspects of them. Yes, I mean, networks have dynamics that are similar to social networks. All these kind of phenomena have the same kind of networking properties. But we want to know what's happening with people and where it's important. So in the sense they're discovering infrastructures, because being able to apply things like the small world notions to all sorts of phenomena, we're finding lots of patterns that are the same across different kinds of environments, different kinds of among ants, among people, among lots of kind of physical phenomena. So as far as looking at media, though, I think there's very few of us who use networks to look at media. There is much more interest now in the hypermedia, hypertext, hyperlinking environment. So, and a whole area called webometrics is developing. And in that community, there's a lot of people who look at the structures of connections by web pages linking to other web pages.
This is like Richard Rogers, the web sphere analysis, this kind of thing.
Yes, a lot of those kind of things. And that's a different one. I mean, you're looking at what people have created. So in a sense, it is a social network. But then I'm staying more with what people are doing with each other. So in the sense where people are looking more at the internet altogether as a network, that they are looking at as an infrastructure, but they're trying to map the whole thing to find out what's going on where. And I'm trying to find out what people are doing with each other. So in that sense, I mean, what people are doing with each other goes back to phrases that were used about computer-supported cooperative work is that people work through the computer with other people rather than working with the computer. So the early HCI experiments were looking at more at what people did with the computer. And then when the area of cooperative work developed is what can you do with other people. And that's kind of the tradition I come out of, and looking at what people are doing with each other through the media. Now, I'm not sure if I've answered your questions about the social networks there, but the infrastructures. Not that many people are looking at media in this way. As I say, the only other people, Barry Wellman's looking at this, Annabelle Kohn-Haas is looking at some instant messaging, the kind of new phenomenon of instant messaging. Emmanuel Koku also has been looking at multiple media use. But as far as looking at it as the kind of social infrastructure, the kind of crossover between the technical and social infrastructure, I'm not aware of other people who are looking at this kind of stuff. I mean, some of the stuff that you're doing, looking at infrastructure, where the wireless networking is going in, could be akin to this, in the sense that is where you're looking at the social and technical implementations.
Well, let me follow up on that, actually, since I feel safer there, I know more about it. And that's if I were to summarize a portion of your paper, I would say that in part of it, you point out that new communication infrastructure is creating the potential for new social networks, and this is the idea of the latent tie that you've explained. So your example, in one part, you use the example of internet social support sites as an example of someone creating something that can then be a platform to facilitate new social networks. So as someone who studies infrastructure, when I think of infrastructure, the first thing that I think of is always that infrastructure is itself driven by someone's idea of what connections would be useful. For example, I would think of an example of infrastructure for my work being rural internet broadband penetration, and that's driven very much by a conceptualization of a market where somebody thinks, well, the people in this community have a lot of money and they're going to be more likely to buy services like this, so we should put the new infrastructure in that community and we should leave out this other community. So, for example, Manuel Castells once defined networks as connections between valuable places in a non-contiguous pattern. So this is very much the way that I think of infrastructure, as someone deciding where to put it. So given this, I wonder, we've kind of followed a thread around in a circle a little bit, because we say, well, people decide where to put infrastructure, but then infrastructure facilitates the creation of social networks between people. So is there some underlying factor that is explaining what's going on across these groups? And one that came to mind when reading your paper was certainly wealth. You know, the wealth, socioeconomic status. This idea that ideas about media choice, for example, multiplexity and the choosing between media in a portfolio of different media options like IRC and the web and webboard. I mean, if we broaden this argument out from distance learning to society as a whole, it's the people with money that get to choose from a wide portfolio of media options, it seems to me.
Yes, they do. And that's, going back to what you said about people making choices about it, I mean, that's precisely the point that comes out of the latent ties, is the responsibility then on who's going to put in the infrastructure and where it gets put in. So one of my key points is that it's somebody outside the people who want to talk who are creating the structure that then lets it be possible for people to connect. So really the information highway, the superhighway, is a key thing. The fact that people move to put public access points in libraries is a decision that's made not by the people who go into the library to use them. And the same thing really in the provision of information resources in the library, same kind of thing. But very much it's a decision by somebody else. And the same thing about, as you say, the last mile for rural access, and telephone and internet and all those kinds of technologies. Somebody else is deciding where and when they will spend the money. So yes, you have very much on a governmental level, it's more likely you're going to put in infrastructures like this in the city first and rural second. So it's true that the potential for people to connect with each other in the city is going to be greater than the people in the rural areas to connect, or city to connect with rural. And that's why I thought, by realizing that that's what's happening also within media, it's putting the responsibility on somebody other than the people who are going to communicate. So my own examples are really looking, perhaps in a smaller context of looking at groups. So you put together, and the instance I'm looking at was you put together a distance learning group. How are you going to get them to communicate? If you don't put in a structure and also the social structure of that to encourage people to communicate, you're not going to get them to communicate. So there's these responsibilities both technically to have the apparatus there, but also socially. And if I go back out to the internet, then there's a lot of discussion now about whether the content that's on the web is of interest to people. So again, it's the responsibility of somebody other than the people who are going to use it at the first instance to get that going. So we see a lot of grassroots stuff that gets stuff going. Community networking initiatives, very responsible way of getting things up and going for the community, whereas the community itself is not going to be able to do that, or perhaps not realizing what the point of it is. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, I think we're very much in the similar line about what I mean by the infrastructure and there.
Well, let me follow up on two words that you used in that answer that are interesting ones, and one is potential and one is responsibility. So I'll start with potential. Potential in the way that you just used it was referring to this potential for the creation of social networks when you have a latent tie.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we could broaden this beyond mediated communication. So in social network analysis, traditionally, from what little I know, I understand that explanations are often used to understand a social network that involve things like geography or space. So you say the person who has a desk in the center of the office that everyone has to pass by is more likely to become the center of a social network, or at least about some topics.
Well, it's a hypothesis we like to test.
Right. Well, yeah. So I wonder then, human geography is also no accident, in the same way that communication infrastructure is no accident. Your likelihood of running into people who are like or unlike you is not random at all. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, would you say that this concept of the latent tie also applies to unmediated communication? Like, would you characterize this person sitting in the center of an office as having latent ties because they have the potential to run into people more often, whereas in the example you use in the paper at one point, if Cerise were actually not physically located in the same place, then there would be no chance of a latent tie of geographical proximity. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely agree. Geographical proximity, but also temporal. So it's not just the fact that we all come to the same building. We need to come to the same building at the same time, so we can increase the chances that a latent tie becomes an actual tie. And by that I mean that people actually start talking to each other or communicating with each other, exchanging resources with each other. So yes, it's definitely the same kind of thing, that anything that brings people together. So we can talk about online communities that bring people together. So there you don't need the physical geography, but you do need something that brings them to the site over and over again. So asynchronous communication wonderfully lets you get around the temporal co-location. But from looking at the distance learners, the temporal part is extraordinarily important to a lot of people. So they really, as they say, they really need to get the immediate feedback. So there may be something that's more stimulating or more encouraging to them to actually feel part of the whole thing by actually coming together at the same time in the same place. Face-to-face, of course, yeah, as I say, you can run in and out of the same building and you might leave notes for people. Like going different day and night shifts, you might pass things over, but it's not quite as, the chances of it coming to a stronger tie are not as good as if you're actually co-located and then working on something together. So you can have the office next to somebody, and if you do nothing with them, if they're somebody who's in a completely different field, it's really part of the reason that we look to co-locate teams of researchers. Mm-hmm. That research institutes are put together in a way that bring people physically together. So I do think there's still a very important role for the physical co-location, but I think it fits in the same manner as other media. I use media, but I also mean just plain means of communication. Mm-hmm. So a face-to-face scheduled meeting is different from an informal meeting, but all of these are means that help people get to know each other. But again, you don't tend to set up for yourself a scheduled meeting with a bunch of people you have no ties with. So that's something, again, how many times do we meet people at conferences? Randall Collins has a wonderful book, The Sociology of, I'm going to forget the whole title, but he talks about the energy that comes from people getting together at conferences. And that, you can feel it. I mean, something about it brings people together, and you start hearing different voices. And yes, more the potential you bring like-minded people together. And that's the same thing that people try to do with online listservs, with, as I say, online communities, any kind of discussion area online. The other side of it, which is not something we discussed here, is that can help keep ties going. So the fact that you mentioned one of my co-editors there, Barry Wellman, we were completely separated in the whole time. He's in Toronto, I was in Urbana-Champaign, and we managed the book at a distance. And also Michelle Kasmer, who I did the Learning, Culture, and Community book with. She's in Florida, I'm in Illinois, and yet we had a strong social relationship beforehand. Now we're distributed, and the technologies can keep us together because we're able to communicate more frequently, more easily, not playing phone tag, passing documents back and forth, all sorts of different ways of keeping things together. And again, those are more multi-channels. So we're not just saying, how's your career going? We're saying, what are you reading these days? Here's a chapter for the book, and I've edited it, and you can send it back edited, and so on and so forth. So we keep a stronger tie with all these different kinds of things we're doing. So, there's multiple ways that the media are useful. But also, we couldn't do that if the infrastructure didn't exist. So unless governments and universities had put in access to computer media, we wouldn't be able to do this kind of work. Which, again, it starts the whole thing growing because, again, you get more used to doing this and it becomes a more normal way to make contact with people. So you don't have to have a formal introduction anymore. We often get into our emails, requests for all sorts of information from people you've never heard of, and we do our best to answer them. But that's not so strange anymore that you can do that. I mean, before you might have written a formal letter, I suppose, but otherwise you perhaps would have been unable to make the contact.
Well, this choice about deploying the infrastructure that you used earlier, the word responsibility, this research really highlights the responsibility of those in a position to make decisions about where infrastructure should be deployed. This is a really fascinating way of thinking about this, particularly when you think about it from the perspective of policymakers. My own work is in law and policy, and I think it's fair to say that regulators, governments, when they make decisions about infrastructure, they generally do not feel able to control infrastructure very much. And so when I was reading this, I thought, well, this is interesting because Caroline has these studies from an online learning situation, which it seems like there's a lot of control in that the instructor can say, you have to use this medium for this purpose as a part of this course, or you get an F. Whereas governments rarely, even though we think of them that way, when you are a regulator, you don't think of them that way. You think about market pressures, industry demands, lobbyists. It doesn't feel like you actually have much freedom to exercise this responsibility. And so I was thinking about this. I was thinking, well, I wonder if that's more true for corporations and for online learning environments. But then I thought about people I know who work at corporations and online learning environments that take classes online. And it seems like even there, the amount of control that you have is sometimes more limited than you might think. So that corporations, for example, have tried a number of policies to control the way that their employees use media, how they choose media multiplexity in their job. So they do things like prohibit instant messenger or ask them not to use cell phones, put a limit on how much they can use cell phones, put a policy in place about how they use the telephone. All of these kinds of things are ways that an overarching body that is not the individual tries to control the individual's choice of media. However, so this is interesting because you talk about this responsibility, but I wonder how much control we ever really have over adding or removing a medium. I mean, in a way, even in the case of the instructor, I imagine instructors in LEAP would perhaps, I don't know, maybe you could tell me, tell you stories about how they didn't feel like they had that much control. They told students to do this one technology and they didn't like it or they didn't use it. And so I wonder if you could address this idea of responsibility.
Well, I think there's a couple of examples that show that the governments do have do and can force people to use things the way they want. One of the ways that happening, a lot of reports are being put online and no paper copies being made. Mm-hmm. You have made a switch. You have shifted the burden over to individuals to have access to a computer, to possibly have access to a printer to get these reports. And it's a bit like diffusion of innovation. I mean, they say, if you want to move people from one innovation to another, you put it in place and you get rid of the old one. There's no option. So that's the first place. Government does have control. There's also government reporting that now you can see there's more and more shift to want you to submit your taxes online and that sort of thing. And at some point, the paper copy undoubtedly will go. Some of the questions there is who have you disenfranchised by doing that? And that's an open question, and there are people who look at, particularly as stuff goes online, information reports go online, who can and can't get them. But also I've been doing some research with Chris Hagar in the UK in farming community. And what's happening there is that the government is asking for all the reporting and the monitoring of livestock to be done online. Now you can still do it by paper. It apparently takes, you do fill out your paperwork, you send it in. It takes 2 weeks to get a piece of paper back. So a lot of farmers are moving on to the next system. And so, and along with that, there's an increased desire by the government to have reporting done electronically. So again, we can see that we are actually having an effect on what people do and where. The other thing you mentioned about organizations not wanting people to use all these different kinds of media, one of the side effects that you can take from the stuff that I've been doing is, okay, so that means that you're cutting off the communication use by the people who are most closely tied. So what's the implications of that? Okay, so you might be stopping friends from chatting all day, but you're also likely to be stopping people who have a need to get together about work from communicating with each other. So I'm not sure that it's a very good policy to stop people using all kinds of media. I think some of these things are an attempt to regulate behavior, but that's not regulate. That's regulating, not regulating. It is, I mean, in a sense, it is an attempt to have responsibility for people not talking. Mm-hmm. But given that that's going to affect your strongest ties in your organization, it seems to me the wrong end to work on. You should work on the other end that says, let's get people talking. But of course, that depends on whether you have a basic idea about how people should work together, that, collaborative learning, collaborative work. If you believe that people should talk to each other and should benefit from that, then you want to give them lots of means of communication.
Right, so you could imagine a difference between white-collar information work and, say, data entry or something, or the call center or something like this.
I could see, yes. If you want people to be, not talking to anybody but customers or doing specific work, yes. On the other hand, I mean, you could be missing all sorts of informal, shortcuts on how to do these things. I mean, call centers, people are dealing with, sometimes with irate people, sometimes with people who aren't understanding them. Why cut off the ability to talk to other workers to help understand how to deal with that kind of situation? So I'm not really one that wants to cut off a means of communication, so I'll find some good way to give people more chance to talk with each other. I think I am a collaborative worker, because I have my inclination is that people can learn from each other, so they should be given the opportunities to learn from each other.
Mm-hmm. Well, my next question is a little bit of a different direction, and that's to, I guess it's to get back to this idea of responsibility we were talking about in the deployment of infrastructure. I mean, my interest there is I really like this paper because it highlights a distinction that's often made in telecommunications policy between an infrastructure that is universal and an infrastructure that is not. Now, in this paper, you talk about required or mandated forms of communication because of the leap and the cerise context, I think. So like a meeting you have to go to. But I this...
I was going to say LEAP is the distance education environment. I don't know if we actually
said right. So, but in policy, you often see a distinction that's even a legal distinction between an infrastructure that's universal and one that is not. So there's a particular law in the United States that that mandates that we determine what infrastructures are universal and must be given to all people. So in these studies that you report, tiers of media use are shaped by individual choice and tie strength. I mean, and so the strong tie people make certain choices, and the weak ties make other choices about media.
But within the group, they're making the same choices. This is the odd thing, is that everybody uses the group-wide communication medium.
Right.
So weak and strong use that one. It's just stronger the tie, the more they add other channels onto that. But they're adding them on in the same sequence. Right. Which is also interesting and extraordinary.
The unidimensional scale.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, so my question about this really is just that. What is my question? Oh, it's just that when you think about this distinction of a universal infrastructure, I mean, I like this a lot because of the idea that it follows directly the policy logic of some sort of central decision about what infrastructures are universal. So I wonder, what's the analogy? Could we push the analogy even further and say that in a classroom setting or in a work setting, you have some communications that are required? So it seems like the e-government scenario you just gave about tax forms is like saying that in some societies, society or government is requiring you to use some means of communication. So, I mean, a question that came up in my mind then is, how can we understand individual choice of media in a context where more than one are really required? Because in society, it seems that we do have more than one are required, right? Because in the law, the telephone is definitely is considered a universal infrastructure that must be provided to all people, and so is the post office, right? The post is another universal infrastructure that seems to be required. So, what do these sorts of findings tell us about how people behave when there's more than one that is required? Or is this an open question?
I think it's a bit of an open question. I mean, what I keep coming back to is the idea of the roads. That roads are a government-placed infrastructure, but you have to buy your own cars. So we're getting an analogy here when we get the information highway, but you have to buy your own device in order to be able to drive on that highway as well. So we have a little bit of a separation between what is universal and provided and put in place and maintained by government, and what the individual needs to bring to that infrastructure to get it to work. I'm not sure where that's going in the context of what I've been discussing, but I think it has a lot to do with bringing people to the table. I mean, you can have a building, but people have to get to it. So it's not completely, in a sense, the infrastructure is not completely the government's responsibility, but without it's a meeting in some way, and a meeting in the two sides, so that you can provide that which individuals can't provide themselves. So you can buy a car, but there's no point in having a car if you can't go on if there isn't a road to go onto. You can buy a computer, but now you can't. I mean, yes, we used to buy computers and use them ourselves, but to communicate with other people, you need infrastructure. And we used to go onto proprietary systems, and then they moved out of the business areas and into available to everybody. So there's differences there. I was thinking also one of the things that is important is the public versus private.
Right.
So there's the public highway, there's the public internet with things put on web pages, but there's the private communications that happen. And what's very important as those ties get stronger is to be able to have a private means of communication. So again, having regular mail that the government's not allowed to open is a very important way of having a tie between people that can be maintained in privacy. And electronically, at this point, I'm not sure we have the same set up because email has been deemed as belonging to the organization. Governments can go and, well, the U.S. government can go and look at the emails, who's talking to whom. We have protection on mail, but we don't have protection on internet mail in the same way. So I think there is definitely a public-private aspect to it that needs to be explored further. I said I don't really have an answer to that at the moment, but I think it's a really interesting and important way that there's more than one kind of means of communication. We have been using more than one. I mean, we use the telephone, regular mail, travel for face-to-face communication. So we basically have three that we use anyway. But there's public forums. I mean, people always forget that face-to-face has a public and private view to it as well.
Sure.
So a public lecture versus a private tutoring session. These are quite different things, and yet they still get bundled up under face-to-face. So it may be a little bit more finding out what the nuances of face-to-face, which one thing about computer-mediated communication, it made us look again at what it was important or not about face-to-face to see what was being lost, quote unquote, in CMC. And then we find that we were discovering some new things, like anonymity, which is another aspect of it. I mean, we've been talking now public and private, you know who you're talking to, but there's also areas where you can be anonymous. So that's a completely different kind of phenomenon to look at and see how much should infrastructure allow people to be anonymous. I mean, you're anonymous on the highway. You're anonymous at Mardi Gras, but I'm not sure you're anonymous in a lot of the online discussion groups.
Well, I couldn't agree more about this. I mean, from a policy perspective, the policy purpose between a public and a private system of communication is very different. And by public and private, I mean what you mean. I mean this notion of public dissemination versus private exchange. I mean, you want very different things. And it seems to me the current confusion and ambiguity about your rights as a communicator stems from digital convergence making these categories very messy. So the reason we don't have these protections on the internet is that no one has clearly delineated it as having a purpose of public dissemination versus private exchange. And because these are mashed together, we have legal rules that are also mashed together. So I couldn't agree more. And that's I worked on a paper about that topic with Francois Barr, so I want to mention.
Yes,
so
good. I'll have to
I'll
be reading that one, sir.
But I just have actually one more question for you, and that's to pick up on this, the comparison that you made to cars and transportation. I mean, this is very well taken, I think, because it reminded me of Claude Fisher's landmark study of the telephone, America Calling. And Claude, for people who haven't read him, it did a social history of the telephone in the United States to 1940, so really the introduction of the telephone. And after every chapter, he compared the telephone to the automobile to try and understand if the things we were looking at were specific to communication or mediated communication, or was it, what were the differences between the two? And everybody, that book is cited quite regularly, and it's well regarded, I would say. But really, his central proposition at the end of the book is never mentioned or never really taken up by the literature. And the central proposition is, here's someone who did this voluminous study of the telephone. And at the end of it, he says, quote, "Basic social patterns are not easily altered by new technology." So he spent all this time looking for the big effects of the telephone, the big impact, and he didn't find them. In fact, I don't know if I can channel him, but he stopped writing about technology after this book, which implies to me a certain sense of frustration with it as a topic for looking for explanations. And when I was thinking about this book in the context of your paper, I remembered he tried to propose a concept in the book that hasn't been taken up too much, I think, and the concept he termed user autonomy. And it's this idea that users really are the ones who decide how infrastructures are used, and he has a lot of examples of different groups, for example, early telephone companies, trying to convince people to use the telephone in a certain way, and the people who use the telephone just not doing it. So, for example, the campaign to get people to say ahoy when they answer the phone, or the campaign to get people to not have telephone calls about personal matters, to only talk about work.
Business,
So I just wonder, how would you say your work sits with Fisher? Because I mean, clearly you're not as frustrated as he is, unless you're planning to stop writing about technology after.
No, I think that's my career. So Fisher, of course, is somebody the social network people look to as well, his work, and I think he's right. I mean, it doesn't change what people do with each other, but it changes the channels through which they do it, which then can have great impact. One thing that, I mean, now that the telephone is nearly universal, it's hard to remember that there were restrictions on it, which echo very much the restrictions that were put on email to begin with. And now email is well, it's not actually yet universal, but it's getting there, and it probably, as more needs, as computers get easier to buy, people will be more using it.
In developed countries, anyway.
In developed countries, yes, definitely. Yeah, I mean, the penetration of the telephone, I think, is around 99% here. But there is the churn, people who can't afford it and lose access. So there's still a set of people who don't have access to the phone. I just wrote a little note here, the difference between use and connection. Mm-hmm. So it's up to individuals how they use it, but you can only connect to the people who are on. Mm-hmm. So you can't call people who aren't on. Lynn Marcus's concept of critical mass in terms of technology, of course, something picked up from other literature, but her idea that you need a critical mass of users mm-hmm. on this group, group technologies. So without somebody else there, without something getting it up and going, mm-hmm. Others talk about altruistic use, let's say in seeding databases or being in a group that actually starts getting the messages going. These are the kind of problems that people have to start with when things start up, is getting stuff going. Of course, now we have to, the opposite problem we have to handle is too much, including the spam and all sorts of other requests from people you don't know. I mean, too much contact with the weak ties is a whole other end to copy. But I think, yes, use comes from users, and Poulin de Sanctis wrote about adaptive structuration, about how groups determine their own norms of behavior on the technology. So of the groups I looked at, the technology that formed the base for each of those groups was different, because different things were available, different things were mandated or routine. So it's what I think I'm finding here is that there will be something that connects the group for it to be a group. Mm-hmm. But how they use it and which thing it will be is going to be up to the group. Mm-hmm. So there is, I'm going to agree with Fisher. I think that, yes, it doesn't change what people do. It doesn't change what people need to do. People who are closely tied need to talk to each other. People who are weakly tied will just take what's going by. And that's the basics. I mean, I think that's, the people and the ties are the same. But the media can be fun.
Well, on that note, that seems like a good final point on which to conclude, unless you have any further comments.
I think that wraps up nicely. Thank you. Thank you very much for your comments.
Well, it was really a privilege to be able to do this, Caroline, so thank you very much for the invitation, and I hope people immediately read this paper very carefully if they